I'll start with an overview of what's been happening with protests and solidarity with Palestine. So since October, more than at least 125 people were arrested and prosecuted in Egypt for solidarity with Palestine protests. We're talking the vast majority of these people, 95 people, are still in pre-trial detention, some of them since October, so for more than 7 months right now. The charges that most of the protesters, so people were arrested for protesting, even on days where protests were called for by the government, for having for writing Facebook posts on Twitter or Facebook or similar platforms, and even for banner dropping, which is like, even within the context of Egypt, where right to assembly and protest has been non-existent for the last 10 years, still something like a banner drop or a post online, even though criminalization is systematic, is exceeding the legal repressive text existing. So people were arrested throughout this period, faced different kinds of charges, but what's systematic is charges of terrorism under terrorism law. Usually people were facing charges of joining a terrorist organization. They also faced, those who wrote online posts faced charges of promoting fake news and false information. People also were charged under the protest law, which is a very restrictive protest law that we've been having in Egypt for the last, been suffering through for the last years, but also under the assembly law, the colonial assembly law of 1926, which is a very old Egyptian, British law in Egypt during the colonial time. So the majority of the protesters are right now, 95 of them in custody. They're facing, many of them are students. So they're actually having difficulties with their end of term exams, and as high schoolers or university students, the majority of them will not be able to actually attend their exams. So they'll miss educational year as well. And I'll try to use an example of three of the students that were arrested for being part of a group called Students for Palestine. So two of them were actually forcibly disappeared for a week before their parents or their lawyers were able to know where they're held or what kind of charges they're facing when they appeared at the prosecution office. And since then, they've been in custody, and they actually, both of them have difficulties going through their exams in the next few weeks. Generally, this is not unusual for people to be arrested and protest in Egypt throughout the last few years, because Egypt has been going through a human rights crisis basically since 2013. But we're talking about a moment, it's a very specific moment, even though we're seeing solidarity protests everywhere around the world with the Palestinian people. But in Egypt, it's pretty exceptional position, because we're the neighbors to Gaza. The relationship, whether socially, politically, or even in street protests, historically has been between the Palestinian people and the Egyptian people very close. So we're talking about a moment of vast solidarity that is unexpressed in the country, and the very few moments where people try to express these kind of solidarity and do any kind of action actually end up with repression that is, I would say, inconsistent with what the Egyptian government has been saying on this position on what's happening in Palestine and genocide in Gaza. So, and we can go back to this when we're reflecting on the patterns, because I think it's interesting to see a country like Egypt where the government is declaring a public position on Palestine that's different from the US, for example, or Germany, how it ends up actually using also repression of protests, even though it does not make a lot of sense. When I look at the current situation in the last few months, I see like an emergence of almost an international, protest movement that we haven't seen in a very long time. With it comes new politics, new tactics that are moving between borders, and like everybody kind of learning from each other. But I think people like us doing civil rights work, our responsibility is to make sure that we can safeguard the norms of human rights and civil liberties in the meanwhile, if not advancing them, to protect more rights, but to make sure that that now the tactics that states and institutions are using against protesters soon are going to come into the language of human rights spaces and they would like to turn them into norms in the human rights language and spaces. And it's our responsibility to focus on making this not the norm and pointing out how unacceptable it is. And for us in Egypt, this is specifically interesting, not only because it is part of our duty, but because actually normalization of suppression of protest and repression of like student movements and student organizing and organizing at large ends up having very specific impacts on countries like Egypt, where actually freedom of expression and freedom of association has been kind of criminalized for a very long time. So the international normalization of state actions that repress people makes it harder for us to question our government when it represses, all form of protests and organizing generally. So we have to think of this moment as also a battle to defend norms, human rights norms, and that we had from before, if not better.